this morning's speakers. As I talk about our alumni, and it is one of my favorite things to talk about, I love to talk about the good that you're doing in the world. And today we have 4 alumni who are here to tell you more about that kind of work, and I'm pretty excited about it. So we will be starting off with Zach Davenport, class of 19. 20. Oops. Thank goodness you're here to correct me, class of 20. And he will be talking on VR for a more accessible education. After that, we'll have Chujiao, class of 10, who will talk about the importance of what you don't see. Katherine Elliott will follow up, also class of 10, well represented, class of 10, and talking about software for sustainability. And then Polina from our original class of 06 will talk about health tech, COVID-19, and what comes next. Isn't that a great question? What comes next? So Polina, we're excited to have all the answers.
I have all of them.
Wonderful, from you on that. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Zach to get us started. And again, I'm very excited to hear about how our alumni are making a difference in the world. So thank you for coming.
All right, good morning everyone. Can you all hear me okay?
Yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for coming out early relative to some people's normal schedules for a Saturday morning to listen to me talk about my work and all of our work. This is a topic that I'm super passionate about. I'm going to be talking about the work that I do at a virtual reality startup in Jackson, Mississippi, trying to change the face of education through this technology. And I love what I do, and I'm very excited to share it with you all. So, jumping right in, a quick intro for myself in case I know there are some of you all out there who probably don't know me. A lot of you all out there know me. My row of classmates right there. Great to see you all. Thank you for supporting. So yeah, I'm Olin College class of 2020. I studied mechanical engineering. I grew up in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Yeah. And now I am the manager of education and special projects at Lubbock. And it's kind of weird if you think about how did I go from mechanical engineering to making VR, but I've kind of broken it down a little bit. In my time at Olin, I did a lot of creative problem solving and fell in love with that. I did a lot of design and 3D modeling. I did a lot of work with education and thinking about how we can use our tools as engineers to make education better and more accessible. And at Olin, I built real life things. The only difference in what I'm doing now is that I'm building virtual things and they don't have to work in the real world. And in some ways that is even more liberating. So, in terms of what Lubbock is, the company that I work for, we do mostly things that focus on training and education. And I can break that down a little bit more. We do workforce development. So this picture on the left is actually a photo of a forklift simulation machine that we recently acquired. So we teach people how to do workforce skills that might otherwise be very costly or in some cases dangerous to train. We do corporate meetings. That little image is the FedEx corporate conference room. And they asked us to recreate that for the pandemic so they could all come back together virtually, see each other, and have what in their minds was a proper meeting in the metaverse, in their home office. And then next up, we do custom educational content. That's my bread and butter. That's what I'm going to be talking about today. But then we also do custom 360 video content and actually do a developer training academy where we teach people around the state of Mississippi how to do what I and the other employees of Lubbock do on a daily basis. So big picture, that is what Lubbock does. So I want to talk about why VR is important to education. And there are a few reasons that I'm going to touch on here. The first one that I want to cover is that VR lets us get a change in perspective. It lets us travel to places that we previously were not able to go, explore things that we couldn't see, and learn things that a lot of people have a much more difficult time grasping if they can't actually see it and interact with it. So what I'm about to show you is actually the very first piece of fully interactive educational content I personally made in VR. And we are going to go shrink ourselves down to the microscopic level and go inside of an animal cell.
Next, I can hit this purple button that says send pre-mRNA to ribosomes. And we'll see it unzip just like it did before. But then our strand of mRNA is going to travel out of the nucleus and on over to the next step in the protein synthesis process. So up next, we have this golden button that says make protein chain. If I click on this, you'll see we have a giant ribosome that pops up. And we start to transcribe our mRNA into a protein chain of amino acids. That will then start folding up and move on off to its next location.
So yeah, you can imagine learning about the protein synthesis process and exploring the cell using boring 2D textbook diagrams, or you can actually be there in person and control it all and make it all happen. We built this location in collaboration with one of our partner schools and teachers. One of the most common questions I get asked is this like the magic school bus? And the answer is yes, yes it is. This partner teacher was from a school out in Arizona. I swear to you, she was the real-life incarnation of Miss Frizzle. She wanted to take her students on a field trip inside the cell and was asking if anything like that currently existed. I said, no, let's build it together. So we arrived at that, and that was just a very brief snippet of that. Oh, I got out of presenter mode. Yeah. Up next, I want to talk about how VR is really great at disrupting outdated traditions in education. And that's especially the case where I live and work in Jackson, Mississippi. Mississippi is not super well known for having the most innovative approach to education. It's no Massachusetts, it's no Olin. And in some cases, students are learning from the exact same teachers, exact same textbooks, exact same lesson plans that their parents did, and it goes generations back. And we've learned a lot more then, especially in the fields of science, technology, engineering, and math. And so we can give these tools to a teacher, and if they just follow through this activity, they basically can understand a more immersive and interactive way of teaching it, then put their own flair on it, and we know that the content is going to be 10 times more engaging and easier to comprehend and break that tradition of just teaching the same stuff in probably a very outdated and maybe even inaccurate way. So I like to say, why would I just show you a 2D diagram of the solar system like that? When I can turn you into an astronaut, take you aboard my spaceship, and we can actually go tour the solar system all on our own.
Now, let's pick a planet to travel to. I'm a big fan of Saturn, so I'll click on Saturn, and off we go. And here we are, right outside of Saturn. I should mention that I can hide or show my capsule at any point in time, but you get some great views with it hidden. And so now that I'm at Saturn, I'm going to click my Unlock Seatbelts button. That'll let me hop out of my seat here. And I can actually get out of the spaceship and go walk around on Saturn. Only problem is that it's not really doing anything right now. But we can fix that. We jump back up to our spaceship here. We've got some buttons in the middle here. We can click spin on axis. And now Saturn is rotating about its axis. You can see it actually rotates pretty quick. And I can walk around Saturn and check out its rings. It's pretty cool. I can do a couple of other things with those buttons. I can click Start Orbit and actually send Saturn going off around the sun, which is way up there. Now,
So yeah, again, just a very brief overview of this experience. I actually heard from teachers that we were working with in Mississippi that space and astronomy was a super important topic to cover because some of these students make it to high school without knowing the order of planets. Something that we might take for granted, but in a place like Mississippi, the teachers are taught to teach to the standards and to teach to the test, and STEM takes a back seat. And so we are trying to fix that by making these experiences that don't require a bunch of activation energy to use, and really just let students explore and kind of figure it out for themselves. Or have an instructor who's passionate about this material, hop in there with them, walk them through it, and put their own spin on it. Up next, I want to throw a few statistics at you. VR is, probably not too surprisingly, very, very good at improving attention and retention of material. When you are in a headset, you can't be distracted by your phone. You are in there, you are fully immersed. We have curated this activity, this experience for you. And so a very famous consulting firm, PricewaterhouseCoopers, actually did a study on VR learners and found that they were 275% more confident in applying their skills that they learned when being taught in VR. They learned content 4 times faster and were 3.75 times more emotionally connected to the content and 4 times more focused. And this is all compared to traditional classroom learners. And part of the reason this is the case is not just because you are in the headset without other distractions, it's because you're actually using multiple senses and combining them all together, and your brain is making those pathways a little bit stronger by actually making it feel like it's picking up things and interacting with them. It's that whole muscle memory, right? I'm tying motion and visuals and audio and all of this stuff together, and I learn the material so much better. So another quick preview.
and the first thing that we see is this matching activity that is designed to teach students about the electromagnetic spectrum. We have a poster over here that explains the activity. And the goal is to pick up these tiles and place them in the appropriate locations on the electromagnetic spectrum. So I can pick them up just by grabbing them with the trigger button under my index finger. And then I can use my left thumbstick to walk around and place them in the appropriate spots. Now there is actually a secret reference guide in this location.
But basically we have students actually learning the electromagnetic spectrum, and then once they get all those labels in,
Gamma rays down here at the very end. Then ultraviolet, right here to the right of this light. Now that we've put all the labels in place, we're presented with a table full of objects that we must also place.
and so we're picking up objects and actually matching them, and we are doing that repeatedly, and so we start to actually get the feel for, this is the order in which things go, this is what belongs in those places, and if I do it enough times, it's going to stick. And then only after you complete this matching activity do the doors open, the triangular doors that you saw open. I'm not sure why this is loading so slowly. But those triangular doors that you saw load open, they split open, and you have access to the rest of what we call the light lab. And in that location, we actually let you play with flashlights, stack light, shine light through prisms, do the double slit experiment, build waves and see how waves actually work in terms of their wavelength and amplitude. All this stuff that I want to show you.
Finally, this super cool Milwaukee neon light that actually does put off some ultraviolet light.
There we go.
And so now that we've matched everything in place, those triangle doors have opened, we can move on the rest of the lineup.
So yeah, that was actually an experience that we built in collaboration with Jackson State University. They are a historically black college or university, HBCU for short. There are a lot of them in the area of where I'm working, and we find it super important to be able to engage the community in that regard and learn about what they're teaching, how can we use our technology to reach them and make their content more exciting, approachable, accessible, etc. And finally, the last point that I want to talk about here is VR can really help you build compassion and empathy. We think that's super important because it lets you put yourself in anyone else's shoes and experience the world through their lens, even those who may have lived decades or centuries apart from us. So a very big figure in Jackson, Mississippi was Medgar Evers. The airport is literally named after him. He was a very prominent civil rights icon that unfortunately his name is not too well known around the state, outside the state of Mississippi. But we wanted to change that. So we were actually working with the family of Medgar Evers to recreate his home where he lived and where he was unfortunately assassinated in the 1960s. And so we can use this to actually immerse you in that time period, tell his story, talk about his legacy, and make you feel like you are right there in the moment.
This is the home of Medgar Wiley Evers, Field Secretary for the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People of Mississippi. So he was the very first Field Secretary for the NAACP in Mississippi. He was a leader in the struggle for justice and equality, born July 2nd, 1925, and assassinated right here at his home on June 12th, 1963. If we move over to the carport, you can actually see some spots on the ground that, at the request of the Evers family, were added to this 3D model to show what actually happened on that night back in the 1960s. This is as the location appears today, and this is an important part of preserving the legacy of Medgar Evers and of his house. We can head on inside by going over to these steps and just walking straight through the door. And so now look around. We are in the living area of the house. We can teleport over to the couch, or really go sit at any of the chairs in the location. And I would encourage you to look around at some of the details in this location. We've got some family photos that you would have seen in the house. Even the books on the bookshelves are the books that Medgar and his family would have had on their shelves here.
So yeah, VR is a tool for time travel, for empathy, for really understanding all the different parts of the world in ways that we believe you wouldn't really be able to understand it in many contexts. So I want to talk briefly about how do we actually make this accessible. And it's amazing, right now the pandemic has changed everything. There are so many little pots of money set aside that schools have access to, where they have oftentimes millions of dollars to spend to make their education better. And so we show them what we can do, and we encourage them to think outside of the box. And all of that recently, for example, led to us fulfilling a contract with Mississippi State Funding to deliver 552 mobile standalone headsets out to a very rural county in Mississippi. So that was entirely funded by the state of Mississippi. It's just knowing how to find it, and then of course making sure that the teachers are well equipped. We're not just going to drop this technology on them and leave. That would be amazingly unethical. And so we train and we do professional development and we get them comfortable and we say, what are your thoughts on how this is going to work best in your classroom? And we spend that time. We work with content area experts to actually make sure that we align this content to their standards, to the state standards, and we equip them with tutorials and resources that if they forget any of this or they want to train up other teachers as well to spread the word, they have all of those tools to be able to do it. So we make sure we leave them in good hands, and we're really trying to make this as accessible and approachable of a tool as possible, because their students love it. They've never seen anything like it. They spend hours and hours in the headset, no problem, and passively just learn so much without even realizing it. So briefly, what's next? I'm working on expanding our content library. I am actively developing all of this content in partnership with schools and organizations around Mississippi. A big one especially is civil rights in Mississippi. We're actually working on making a civil rights museum where characters like this are going to come to life, walk around, talk to you about their stories, and it's going to feel like you're there standing right next to them. So we tell people that there's really no limit to what you can do, it's just your imagination, and we have to remind ourselves of that sometimes. We're really trying to push the envelope on what's possible here, while also making sure that we do good in the community, teach what needs to be taught, and make sure we're doing it responsibly. So that's all I got. If you all have questions, I would be
Awesome.
more than happy to answer.
Thank you, Zach. What a round of applause. Let's just have just one or two questions and then move on to the next speaker.
Yes.
First of all, really cool stuff.
Thank you.
It's really awesome that you're doing this. And it's
Can we
really
give you,
cool.
can we give you the microphone so we can be sure
Oh,
that
yeah,
questions are recorded?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I was saying it's really cool. It's a really cool way to change up education. But I was wondering, how did you measure statistics like how people were more focused? And is that something you measured yourself or somebody else measured? Or?
Yeah. So those statistics that I showed you were actually from a world-renowned consultancy firm, PricewaterhouseCoopers, and they did that study specifically on VR education. If you Google PwC VR learning study, those results will pop right up. So those kind of people do that for a living. They walk you through how all of those metrics were taken. And in terms of our own logistics of collecting data, that's something that we're trying to work through and do for ourselves because our teachers really value it. But data and analytics is something that we're still very new to and are trying to figure out how to do properly, safely, ethically, all of the above.
I think I know we have so many questions. We'll take one more.
There's one behind you.
Hey, great presentation. I was wondering, given that this technology is still relatively new, is there any way that you can tell that students are retaining this information over long periods of time and that it's sticking in their long-term memory and not just a short-term cool thing?
For sure, yeah. So we've seen quite a bit of success with that, and also the study that I just cited has seen a lot of success with that as well. Our success with that right now is mostly anecdotal, and we're trying to figure out how to actually track that. But we find, in a very similar style to Olin's Do Learn approach, when you have students actually in an environment that is relative to the topic that you're teaching, engaging hands-on with the content, adding in manipulables. When teachers come back and ask questions about that later, the students got it because they were right there. They were holding on to this DNA molecule right there. They were looking at that double helix. In their minds, they were right there interacting with it. And like I was saying, it's that kind of cross-sensory input of visualizing it, touching it, having sounds and all of this stuff that really makes it so much powerful and able to stick better in students' long-term memories.
Wonderful. Thank you, Zach. Chujiao, come on up. Shifting gears now, Chujiao is going to speak a little bit about the work she does in cybersecurity. And just so you know, our format will be one or two questions after each presentation. And then if we do have time at the end, we'd love to bring all of our speakers down for a few more questions. Thanks.
Is this mic coming? Hello?
Yes.
All right, cool. Awesome. So this is the first time I'm presenting with a mask, and I'm a speed talker. So words to catch my attention.
Oh,
Yeah.
this one.
Like
Oh,
an ice
okay.
cream cone.
All right.
Yes.
All right. So, my name is Chujiao, and today I'll be talking to you about the importance of what you don't see in cybersecurity. And so, first of all, a little bit about me. I graduated from Olin in 2010 with an EC degree. And I'm the kind of person who likes everything, and my high school friend said, well, my defining trait is I'm random. And so I was like, all right, so I can go into industry or I can go and get a grad degree. What do I want to get a grad degree in? Well, my thought process was, this is the last chance for me to learn something led by a professor. So what is something that I'm curious about, but might be a little difficult for me to learn by myself? And the answer to that was cybersecurity. So that's how I went to University of Connecticut to get a PhD with a focus on cryptography or cybersecurity. And that is also where I became involved in a lab that is in collaboration with Comcast. And that provided me with a first glimpse into how cybersecurity is used in the real world. And that is kind of fascinating because there are all these brilliant, smart people in grad school who come up with amazing solutions. So why are they not implemented? Well, there's a large distance between kind of prototype versus the real world because you have to think about deployment, scalability, and all those issues. And I don't want to make the perfect solution. I want to make a solution that is usable, that is practical, and that's why I decided to go into industry. And now I'm currently a security researcher at Comcast. So at Comcast, originally I thought, oh, they just work with cables, why do they need a security researcher? Don't tell my manager I said that. But so as I got there, I realized, oh, they also work with mobile. They also work with internet. They also work with entertainment. And I really enjoyed that because I was able to work on a variety of projects and realize how cybersecurity influences pretty much everything. So take your normal household, for example. Nowadays, a lot of people use home security. And if a hacker gets access to that, they can get remote access to your security camera and see what you do. They can get into your house. And then there's the typical things that people think of, like, in the movie, you see the hackers move down the electrical grid, so the heroes and villains can do whatever it is that they do. And even for the cars, nowadays there's a very sophisticated infotainment system, GPS, and all these interactions and information that gets into the cloud, which provides a new point of attack for attackers and new areas that we need to secure as well. And even your laptop. So previously, traditionally, the attacker would hack into personal devices in order to get your money, but that's old school. The new trend is to either do social engineering to get to your information, or they will try to get into your account and get your accounting information in order to hack into the company you work for or the company whose security, whose software you're using. And so they use you to kind of get to the bigger fish. And even your water is not safe. So I don't know how many of you look at security news, but in 2019, which is 2 years ago, I know COVID froze time, but yeah, so a hacker was able to hack into the remote operating system of a water plant in Florida and was able to raise the fluoride concentration to a dangerous level. So fortunately, it was discovered by an operator before it could cause any harm. But that is like an example of something that you don't typically think about. And the last example would be kind of Colonial Pipeline. So that's one of the largest fuel pipeline in the US. And the hacker was able to cause a shortage of fuels across the East Coast, all because that they got access to the password and account information of an employee. But the company didn't implement multi-factor authentication. So from this, you can see that there are a lot of areas like, the attackers can attack the company, the person. It could be a vulnerability due to the policy, and whether you like it or not, and whether you see it or not, cybersecurity directly or indirectly affects all aspects of your life. So instead of asking what can be hacked, it's probably easier to ask, well, what can't be hacked? And that leads to kind of the main point that I want people to think about, because at Olin we do a lot of project, which is awesome. And in academia, for grad school, we come up with a lot of solutions, which is also awesome. But it's easy to sit here one household where say, okay, if you have these tools and make these assumptions, then we have perfect security, which by the way doesn't exist. But what if you have to secure billions of households and billions of people, and everybody have different constraints? Then what happens? And so instead of making security perfect, what you need to do to make security usable is to think about scalability. This might work for if you're just doing a project with one prototype, but it doesn't work when you have to produce billions of them. And also you have to think about compatibility, because there's jurisdictional constraints, and in some cases, some devices are out there for 10 years to 20 years. And so they might not be capable of updates, and they might be used in company critical applications where it's impossible to switch it out without a disruption to the service. And so how do you ensure compatibility without introducing new vulnerabilities? And then there's also convenience. So depending on the type of organization, the type of asset, and the type of user, they might not have the financial resources or the technical knowledge to implement what they need in order to be as secure as possible. So in this case, security becomes not a question of what is the most secure solution, but what is the most usable solution. And that is something that I work on at Comcast. So I work on quite a few different projects, and these are just the ones that have been published. So first one I work on is crypto agility, which basically refers to the ability to easily update the cryptographic algorithm with minimal impact to the infrastructure and performance overhead, which sounds pretty simple, right? And it's important because change is inevitable, whether due to government regulations or new technology or vulnerabilities. But transition can be difficult due to the factors mentioned previously, because you can't suddenly recall billions of devices, and you don't want a huge impact on performance. And what happens if you can't replace old devices? And so, and in some cases, the roadmap is also needed, because it affects not only the algorithm itself, but also the protocols, the surrounding, the supporting infrastructure, and everybody who works with it. And so for this project, what I did was basically look into a risk assessment that takes into kind of the financial, the technical, the logistical constraints in order to help organizations to prioritize and optimize their response. And the second project I worked on is slightly more cool. So it's open source library. And currently about 80 to 90% of commercial applications uses open source library. And that's a huge percentage. Now, if you're using a very popular open source library, you can kind of assume that, okay, a lot of people are looking at it, a lot of people use it, so it's probably secure. But what if you're using an open source library that is not popular externally, but it's used in a company critical application? Well, then you are introducing possibly hidden risk into your system. And what if you're using hundreds and thousands of open source libraries? Then where do you start in terms of securing a system? Because you can't suddenly build a huge team to analyze these when there might not be any vulnerabilities. And so instead, what we're doing is we look at the characteristic of the code itself, we look at indicators of popularity, and indicators based on the past history of security in order to figure out where the risk is concentrated so we can get maximum impact with minimum effort. And then the other project I'm working on that will be published in 2 weeks is on post-quantum cryptography. So quantum computing won't be here, well, it won't be practical for at least another 10 to 20 years, which means that the customer doesn't have to think about it. But if you are somebody who has a lot of assets, well, especially if you're actually encrypting your assets, which you should, then quantum computing actually can drastically change the security landscape. it basically renders all public key cryptography invalid. Now, what does that mean? Well, so public key cryptography basically helps you secure your cyber infrastructure, software distribution, and VPN. And it's also very different from the classical algorithm we're currently using. So that means that you might need to change kind of the infrastructure as well and come up with new policy to help deal with that change. And so in this case, it might be here in 10 years to 20 years, but the last cryptographic transition actually took organizations about a decade and $5 million on average. And this is going to be much harder. So we need to start looking at benchmarking the algorithm and seeing how it affects assets now. And when I say wait, I actually mean the company. But so these are just some of the projects I'm working on. And they might look very different, like there's no connection. But there's one underlying factor for all of them. And that is instead of being reactive and responding to an incident, what we're doing is trying to predict the risk, trying to come up with a plan to respond to change before it happens. We want to be in a proactive solution, a proactive position, so that instead of just trying to scramble around and fix things, maybe houses on fire and exploding, what we're trying to do is figure out a plan so we can be flexible and pivot quickly when things happen to make sure that we fix things and get things in order before it can cause any action harm on our system. And in order to do that, it's a basically group effort by not only the cybersecurity engineers, but also the technicians and the human resource people, the finance people, the operators, etc. And we need to move security to the left. So instead of thinking of security as an afterthought, it's like, oh, I built this new and cool product. All right, I don't want people to steal it. Instead, we want to build the security in from the get-go. Just like how when you're building a house, it is much, much easier if you have a plan for plumbing and electricity and incorporate it in as you're building the house, than to be told, all right, we have 5 million houses with residents living in it, and I want you to build electricity into all of them, with minimal impact to the residents currently living in it. That is much, much more difficult. And so in order to help us secure the ecosystem, and it is a group effort. That also means that basically different people needs to know different type of security information. And so that kind of ties into the usability aspect that we learn at Olin. Oh, there we go. All right. So let's say you see a news article that says, oh, the DES algorithm is broken, so now you need to secure yourself. Well, what does that mean? So if you're a company employee who works in security or a security engineer, you might know, okay, I'm going to go to my browser, I'm going to check out the certificate, we're going to see who's the issuer, what algorithm is used, what is the key link, and I know, oh, I need to get a newly issued certificate, et cetera, But if you're a customer, it's like, oh, well, what does that mean? Where do I find it? What am I supposed to do with this? Well, so instead, what browsers currently do is they have a little icon that basically just shows you it's secure or not secure. Easy enough to understand. And if it's not secure, it says, oh, no, so I click on it. What do I do? What happened? Am I hacked? Well, that says basically, just don't put your password or sensitive information in, but just because you went onto the website, that doesn't mean you've compromised everything. So you're okay just for clicking into the website. And so cybersecurity is a shared responsibility. But different people in different roles need different information in terms of cybersecurity. And so right now, a lot of the time, people think, oh, cybersecurity, we need to do all of these things. But they don't quite think about the usability aspect, which is also as important. And so the last thought I kind of want to leave you with is to think about how to incorporate cybersecurity into what you're doing. Because we're all here are all engineers. We're creators, we're designers, and we're all users of technology. So I would like you to think about, okay, cybersecurity. There is hardware security in terms of tamper-proof casing, secure FPGA. There is software security in terms of how to do secure coding. There is network security which is what you usually see in movies about attacking the firewalls, access control, etc. And then there's also information security, like privacy and how to secure the data. And even if you're very technical, you can be on an attack team where you're looking at penetration testing, or on the defense team where you're looking at incident response. And if you're not very technical, there's a security administrator and manager to make sure that everybody's on the same page about what are the security indicators and what to do when things go wrong and how to ensure things go smoothly. And if you're not in a technological field, it also greatly impacts things like finance, entertainment, medical, and criminal investigation and policymaking. So cybersecurity influences all aspects of our lives. And I strongly encourage everybody to, if you don't take a course in it, at least to look into how cybersecurity can affect what you're doing, or at least how cybersecurity affects you personally as a customer and how you can help secure not only yourself, but your family and what you're doing as well. Thank you.
All right, love to take a couple of questions for Chujiao. Yes.
Hey, I'm really curious about the project you mentioned about open source. That seems really cool. You mentioned that sometimes open source libraries, the piece of security is not guaranteed because maybe they're not actively maintained. But I also heard that it can be a good thing for libraries to be open source because it allows third-party researchers to check out how secure they are. I just wanted to know your personal opinion after looking at it for so long. If you were starting a project from the ground up and you saw that one of the things you were looking at was open source, would you be excited? Would that count for that library, or maybe it discourage you from using it? What do you think?
So, open source is great in a lot of ways. Personally, open source is great because it encourages open collaboration and ideas from different people. And in terms of company perspective, it's also great because it's free. It's free code right over there. And the thing about security is not only about the maintenance and also secure coding, but also sometimes when people stop maintaining it, sometimes this is where social engineering comes in, where malicious hacker might come and be like, hey, I see you're not using this. I love your code. I want to help making it. So you hand it off to this person you trust, and then they put malicious stuff into it, and then spread it to other open source or application that's using it. And that is a security risk. But there are so many benefits that outweighs it that it's kind of impossible now to ban open source, that you can't use open source. That's like saying, oh, you can't use internet. It's like, well, you could do that if you want to be a hermit, but that's not really practical. So the best way is to figure out how to help secure it, whether by engaging the community or engaging your internal company effort and how to optimize the effort.
Thanks. Great. One more question. Yes.
Also, talking about key information on the slide, regarding the post-quantum crypto world, do you foresee a change in how end consumers will, or some adapting action that consumers will need to change when we get to that point? They're like, okay, you gotta change your passwords, but in the shifting to crypto kind of context?
So there are many different types of encryption. Well, so there are basically, quantum computing affects the public key cryptography, which is typically used for transportation of data. And your password is used using hash algorithm, which is used to encrypt stored data. So it doesn't quite affect your password instead of how the information is actually transported. And so the quantum effect is more on the company side rather than the personal side. It theoretically should help make everything faster, but that's also on the company side.
Do you think the change will be concealed behind the scenes? There won't be any consumer action that needs to be taken as part of that?
For the next 20 to 30 years at least, it will be more of a communication between the large companies and nation state because they mentioned like, oh, a practical quantum computer won't be here for 10 to 20 years. And the first one that will be here will have to be built by $1 billion. Well, nobody has $1 billion unless you're a nation state or a huge company. And so the effect will be there and then slowly trickle down. And we don't really know currently how it affects individual customers. We just know that right now they're coming out with quantum resistant cryptography and by the International Institute of Standards and Technology, so that in case it happens, we have a plan.
Thank you very much. Very happy to introduce now Katherine Elliott, who will talk to us about alternative energy. All right. Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? All right. Great. Give them a thumbs up. Good. My name is Katherine Elliott. I'm also class of 2010 with Chujiao, and I'm here to talk about some of the work that I've done as a software engineer in the kind of renewable energy sustainability sector. But I also wanted to highlight the work that some other alums have done in this sector. And some of whom I think are in the audience, so just raise your hand or something if I'm mentioning you. Okay, a little bit about me. I'm Katherine. I was Olin class of 2010. I was a systems engineering major, so I didn't start out as UNC or ECE, but kind of got into that after Olin. I currently live in San Francisco, where I've lived since 2011. And I've also been working on software projects for renewable energy since about 2011. And so I'm here to talk a little bit about different careers in sustainability. I've kind of, even though my whole career has been software in the kind of sustainability sector, in the clean tech sector, I've kind of bounced around in between different parts of that. So I just wanted to highlight there's a whole lot to do in areas that you wouldn't really even think of at first, like energy, water, agriculture, transportation, a lot more. And clean tech companies all need engineers, and they basically, if it's an Olin major, they need it. So software, mechanical, electrical, material science, all of these different kinds of things, clean tech companies are looking for them. And if you're thinking about joining, now is really the best time. Just in the first half of 2021, there was $16 billion in new credit tech investments from VC firms, which is a little dangerous to extrapolate, but it might mean that second half of 2021, there might be another $16 billion, but we will see. We'll see what's going on. So what am I doing now? I'm working at a company called Form Energy. They're mostly based in Somerville, but I'm working out of the new Bay Area office. And we are building a giant battery, and we're building the battery out of iron air chemistry, which was just very recently released to the public, so it's an exciting time at Form. And this battery basically works by, it discharges by letting iron rest, and then it charges by unresting the iron. And so the goal here is to store wind and solar power very, very cheaply. You could do this with lithium-ion batteries, and lithium-ion batteries are able to store energy for about 4-ish hours, but the economics really break down for what we refer to as multi-day storage. So sometimes there will be periods of days where there's not as much solar or wind power on the grid, and in order to store energy for multiple days at a time, the economics just dictates that this battery needs to be extremely, extremely cheap. It has to have a very low capex. So that's where we come in. And what am I specifically doing at Form Energy? I'm working on a software model of the electrical grid. We're calling it quote-unquote firmware. Not to be confused with firmware. We do have firmware at the company, but we're called firmware. And our software model is very concerned with where can we actually sell our batteries. So what we do is we work with our clients on a bunch of different simulations. So, okay, in this client service area, let's see, in the year 2035, let's say they go out, this much
new solar, this much new wind, this much new short duration lithium-ion storage. How much multi-day iron storage could we potentially sell to this plant at this time? Because utilities tend to plan out for the next like 10 years or so, and so utilities are thinking about the year 2030 today. And so this is known in the energy industry as a capacity expansion model. There are many different capacity expansion models, but none of them really quite work with multi-day storage. They don't really know what to do with it. So we're building on our own. And this is in a class of problems called constrained optimization problems. If you are very familiar with constrained optimization, please come talk to me. It's basically, we're trying to meet demand and minimize cost with these sets of resources available. So that lends itself to that class of problems. My focus on firmware is a lot of the tooling and infrastructure. So I'm working on a lot of the code base as well. It's all written in Python, but I am looking at things like, okay, model solve time is pretty slow here. How do we try to reduce it here? And I'm also working on a lot of the kind of stuff that's around it. So, process improvements, data validation, logging, getting Docker set up, trying to figure out why certain CI is failing, getting our AMI set up in AWS, all this stuff that you need to do with any kind of software project. And so, how did I get here? In 2011, I started a place called Energy Solutions out in Oakland, and I was doing payment processing for energy efficiency programs. So if you buy like a new, more energy efficient AC unit or a motor or a fridge, you can get a rebate because the utility gets paid for how much they can claim to have saved energy. And I got my start there as a front-end web developer. I came in mostly knowing PHP, and so this is my first intro to Python was here at Energy Solutions. And I was working with a number of other Olin alums when I was there at Energy Solutions. After that, I started working at the startup called KWH Analytics, and it was also based in San Francisco. We were a solar insurance startup, and I was employee number 5. You can see me right there in the middle. I was hired as a web developer. We were building out a sort of like a custom SaaS product for tax equity investors in the solar space, and I was working on that. But partway through my job there, I switched to more of a data engineer role. So we were bringing in a lot of different data from clients, utilities, trying to basically figure out sort of better quantify solar performance. Or like if you have a big solar farm out in the field, like how's it actually doing? Because we were selling, I guess what I can refer to as a radiance hedge. Basically, it was sunshine insurance. If it's not sunny enough, you can buy an insurance policy against it not being sunny enough for your farm. And if it's within a certain band, you'll actually reimburse your investor. And because, sometimes stuff just falls down or you need to stand servers up, I kind of learned DevOps a little bit on the job there. So, but I wanted to spend the second half of my talk kind of highlighting other Olin alums who are in the sustainability sector. And we're working on a huge variety of different projects. So, to get started, we have Nina and Dan working at Commonwealth Fusion Systems, and they're building out commercially viable fusion and doing that through improving the magnets involved in a tokamak reactor. We have Adam from 2006 at Electric Hydrogen. I think you're in the audience. Hi, Adam, who could actually probably give this talk as well, or a more interesting version, but he's making hydrogen from renewable energy. Laura from 2007 is working at Pivot Bio, which is creating a low pollution fertilizer. Fertilizer is a surprisingly large source of emissions, so they're trying to work on making fertilizer that doesn't interact with soil and create nitrous oxide from its interaction with soil. Nitrous oxide is also a sort of potent greenhouse gas. Bennett from 2009 is working at PG&E, and he's working on a remote microgrids project. So trying to make some rural communities in California basically completely run off of solar and batteries so that they don't have to run high voltage transmission lines out to these rural communities in California. And Andrea is working at Terra Power out in kind of near Seattle. And she's working on a molten chloride fast reactor, which is something that I learned about in putting this talk together. We also have some alumni who have founded clean tech companies. First up, we have 12 by Natasha 06, and who is doing some kind of CO2 transformation to transform carbon dioxide into different materials. We have Erica from 2010, who's starting Accelerate Wind. They are doing wind energy at the sort of commercial and industrial scale, whereas most wind energy is at the utility scale right now. James Bergolinski, 2012, is working on Carbon Collective, which is doing clean tech investing, trying to sort of like decarbonize investments. There's a lot of movement to try to divest from fossil fuels, and he's doing something like that. And also, John K. 2013 is working at NanoGrid, which is working on home energy APIs, and they were acquired by a company called Arcadia, but I want to highlight that in the list of clean tech companies. And so, just a little sort of feature slide on what he is doing at Commonwealth Fusion Systems, the systems manager for the gas fuel cycle, delivering hydrogen gases to the tokamak to generate plasma energy, collecting that gas and recycling it. So this is more of a mechanical engineering role, so you do not have to be a nuclear physicist to work at one of these new nuclear reactor companies. Adam, who is here in the audience, is working on a low-cost electrolysis system that can be operated directly off of intermittent wind and solar resources. And James from 2012 says, your investments have power. They can transition, or they can accelerate our transition to a zero carbon economy, or they can slow it down by enhancing the status quo. So he's working on how to sort of decarbonize our investments. And clean tech companies are hiring engineers. That means you, that means everyone in the audience, that means all the Olin alums. Because when you think about it, there's an enormous amount of work to do in the next century. Basically, all of this stuff, this nice stuff that we all like and enjoy, is sort of subsidized by fossil fuels. This is, a one-time resource extraction event in human history that started the Industrial Revolution and continues today. And it is a huge challenge to try to figure out how to redo all of it, but it is also a huge opportunity. If you want to get into clean tech and sustainability, now's the best time. There's a ton of money going into clean tech right now. As I said, $16 billion in the first half of 2021. And investment means headcount, and headcount means an interesting new career for you. Some practical tips. If you see a company that you like, but maybe they don't have a position open for you right now, look at who invested in them, and then look at their investors' portfolio. Because the Breaker Energy and Energy Impact Partners are two of Form Energy's investors, and they have a lot of different companies that they're investing in, so check them out. And also, I reached out to the alums that I featured in this presentation, and many of them said they're hiring, so take a pic of this slide, maybe write this down if this is something that you're interested in. And so yeah, that is the content of my talk. Are there any questions?
Katherine, that was amazing. I so appreciate you sharing retiring. I'll have to send you a check for that. And like just highlighting all those other alumni, because you're right, they're doing amazing things. So thank you so much for that. Sam.
So this isn't a question, but more of a FYI for other people. So I used to work at strawberry robotics startup, and I guess like most people think of like carbon reduction and things like that, but like food sustainability is also like an issue that has a lot of different ways we can contribute, and like ag tech stuff is also like a field where picking strawberries by hand is like very backbreaking and very like I guess like demoralizing as like a full-time job. Like most people only do it for like a year before they kind of can't do it anymore. So there's a lot of ways you can kind of contribute with other technologies like robotics and things like that too.
Great, thank you. Any other questions, comments? Yes, Eric.
First, thank you for doing this work. Like, this is really cool. Carbon air batteries are really exciting. I guess one of the high-level takeaways is sort of your personal opinion, having worked in this space more and more and seen more and more, particularly on the energy side. Has it overall made you sort of more optimistic or more pessimistic about how the future of that's going to look? I'm sure you sort of have seen some of both in your time in the industry.
Depends on which day you're asking me. I think there is cause. There's definitely, just be very real with everyone, there's definitely cause for a lot of pessimism, but that doesn't mean you can just go home. I don't know, pessimism motivates me to work harder. I don't know, maybe that's a little weird, but I don't know. I think there's still, a huge range of possibilities ahead of us, and it's not just that oh, we're doomed forever. It's a pretty wide range of outcomes, and we do have, some control of the outcomes. I mean, things are objectively going to get much worse, and we don't have a ton of control over that, but we do have some amount of, what we do now determines how bad things are going to be, and there's a big difference between, worst case scenario and mildly terrible. So that's my personal opinion.
As you said earlier, there is a lot of work to do.
Yes, there's a lot of work to do.
So thank you.
All right, thank you.
Welcome Polina Segalova, who will talk to us about healthcare.
Hey everyone, how's it going? I feel like reflecting on the other speakers that have spoken today, I feel like we have all the hot button issues that we covered. I don't know if that was intentional or not, but it was I was really amazed sitting in the audience, hearing everyone else talk, just reflecting on the fact that wow, this is really a group of people, a group of alumni that are dug in and working in areas to make a real difference. So thank you to all of you that spoke, and certainly thank you to all of you who are doing other phenomenal work. So really quickly, my name is Polina Segalova. I am class of 2006. I am an Olin partner. I'll spend a couple of minutes doing a deep rewind and talking about how I ended up working in health tech. And this actually goes all the way back to my high school days. So in high school, I'm sure like many of you, I found out that I was really passionate about math and science. I was also really good at it. And for me, I didn't want to leave all those beautiful equations on the board. I actually wanted to do something with them to help people. And so to me, that was the very logical definition and embodiment of what an engineer is. And this is one of the main reasons why I chose to come to Olin. So fast forward a few years, I was enrolled in mechanical engineering, and I had this decision to make, and it was to grad school or not to grad school. And some of us have taken a journey and have our own criteria. Mine was very simple. Are you a school in the state of California with shiny weather? If you are not, I am not applying to you. So I literally only ended up applying to 3 schools. They were all in California. I ended up going to Stanford. I pursued my PhD there, also in mechanical engineering, which sometimes made it seem like, wow, it was so focused because you went through your bachelor's, your master's, and your PhD all in one discipline. In reality, as many of you know, mechanical engineering is so freaking broad that you can pretty much do anything in it and probably fit under that umbrella. So it was really good for me to be in a discipline. But the great thing that I really discovered and learned in grad school was the health tech and med tech industry. So Stanford is really, really well connected in that overall ecosystem. And that was a logical next step for me. So coming from high school to Olin, I really connected the love of math and science and wanting to do something good to help people. And I felt that I pushed it even further in grad school, that I realized, oh my gosh, there's the one time where you really, really want to help people, and it's when they're sick. And I know that a lot of us also have deep motivations for the industries that we work in, but for me, that's been one thing that's been incredibly motivating whenever I go to work in the morning, because at the end of the day, I do feel like I'm using my energy, I'm using my brain power, and I'm using my experience to actually move the needle in a really meaningful area. So with that said, today I'm going to be talking a little bit about health tech. I'm going to be talking about COVID-19, and I have all the answers on what comes next. So in all seriousness, I definitely don't have all the answers. My goal for putting the talk together today was really to help people have a little bit more of a grasp on the headlines that they see, stuff that comes in their social media feed, just again, to get like a little bit more of a tangible grasp in the sector. So with that said, let's talk a little bit about why healthcare is so complicated and so broken. So this is something that comes out quite a bit, like yes, we know healthcare is complicated, we know that it's segmented, and we know that it's broken, especially in the US. There's really two things that I want you to take away from this slide. Number one, we have employer-sponsored health insurance. And number two, a lot of our spending really happens way, way downstream of when people get sick. So it's really about chronic conditions and about emergency department visits. It's really not upstream. It's really not about keeping people healthy before they get sick. So the first point, how do we get to employer-sponsored health insurance? So this is really a weird fluke from World War II. So rewind back decades and decades. During World War II, and certainly right afterwards, the US government implemented a wage freeze to make sure that we didn't spin out and have a bunch of inflation. And so what that meant is employers had to compete in some other way to get all these employees into their door. And the way they competed was to offer benefits, and specifically to offer private health insurance benefits. There was follow-up legislation that actually made those benefits tax exempt. And this is how you really had a skyrocketing of this phenomenon of employer-sponsored health insurance. If you're wondering why this didn't happen in Europe, and why Europe really has a centralized government-sponsored health insurance program, well, it's because Europe and the US were in really, really different states after World War II. Overall, the US, from an infrastructure perspective, was still doing okay. I mean, we didn't have bombings. Infrastructure was largely still operational. You look at Europe, and they were on a scale from bad to decimated. And so for them, really, the only entity that could possibly offer health insurance was a centralized government. So that's one of the reasons why there was really such a split. And by the way, this might be a prompt for, which I'm sure a lot of you should vote. If you don't, this is a plug for yes, go vote, because it turns out voting in the legislature actually doesn't make a difference. And then again, the second point that I wanted to make is about the overall spending that we have in healthcare. So you have this handy graph on the bottom that shows you how much, the different buckets of basically of expenditure that go into healthcare. So first of all, as a percentage of GDP, we're creeping towards 20%. 20% of our GDP goes towards healthcare, which is really, really bananas. It's a super, super high number. But I think the thing that's really striking is how those numbers are actually spent. So again, if you look at the really, really large blue bar, that shows you the dollar signs that are really spent on emergency visits, on basically stuff that happens when you're already really, really sick, and not things that happen upstream that could possibly prevent you from getting really, really sick. All right, so that's a little bit about healthcare overall. And then, oh my gosh, COVID hit. Holy cow. So there's a lot of crazy stuff has been happening in the world, at least in the last 18 months or so. For my industry, I have seen changes that I was projecting maybe 5-10 years down the road, basically come into effect in the last 18 months, which has been really, really incredible. And so specifically, where you probably see this the most is the adoption of telehealth. So the reason for this is pretty obvious. We have shelter in place, we have lockdowns, you literally can't go to a doctor's office. And so what happens is you now need technology to actually help and bridge that gap, which is phenomenal. Some things that are not so phenomenal. Oh, and by the way, the graph that you see here basically shows you, hey, this is what happened with telehealth visits when certain waivers and legislation was put in place that actually made reimbursement for telehealth visits the same as in-person visits. And you can see the bar goes up. You can also see emergency department visits. So this is like in-person, you trying to go and seek care. That has gone down. So not surprising. I think the question is, once we are out of the pandemic, exactly what the curve of those graphs end up looking like. But the second thing that I wanted to talk about is the inequities that really surfaced during the pandemic. It's definitely a perfect storm. If you think back to the previous slide when I talked about the fact that health insurance is really tied to employment in the US, you have a pandemic that's influencing unemployment and therefore is keeping people out of their jobs, and also health insurance, and we're in a pandemic. So that's been an incredibly difficult thing to witness, just being in the industry. The other thing that I wanted to point out, as wonderful as health tech is, there is definitely a good portion of it that relies on things like a reliable internet access, which not everyone has. So even in a sort of a utopian future where perhaps more and more care can be delivered in a remote fashion, we still have to keep in mind the fact that not everyone actually has the technology and the equipment to participate. And then the last thing I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about is what comes next. So, Kevin, it was interesting hearing you talk about investment in clean tech. Health tech has also spiked significantly. There's just a lot of VC money looking for a home. And similar to clean tech, engineers are needed in a lot of roles, technical roles, leadership roles, but essentially it's a really diverse industry that if you're looking at, certainly if you're looking at systems, if you're looking at mechanical, electrical, software, et cetera, there are a ton of opportunities to pursue. But the other thing that I wanted to highlight is if we're looking at trends that are about to play out in telehealth and health tech in general, remote monitoring, remote visits are definitely on the horizon. With the remote monitoring specifically, this is a thing that was coming into people's radars anyway, mostly because we have a silver tsunami, if you will. Baby boomers have retirement, and there's now really a lot of institutions leading to a concept of aging in place. So forget nursing homes, forget sort of taking someone out of their environment. The goal right now is let's keep people in their homes, in the places where they live for as long as possible. So how do you do that? A lot of it has to do with putting in technologies that are able to let those people be monitored and seek assistance if needed. The other thing that I want to highlight is there really does seem to be a shift to focus on outcomes and to focus on preventive care. And so when looking at outcomes specifically, if you look at the way that we currently build in the US healthcare system, a lot of it is really built for procedures, for CT scans, for MRIs, for that specific equipment that's used. But it's not actually built for, hey, did this person get better? Did they not have to come in 18 months later to have XYZ done? And so that second scenario, outcomes-based billing and reimbursement, it's really hard to do. Like, it's a lot easier to actually look at the overall healthcare system and point to a specific event, like getting an X-ray, getting an MRI, or getting a hip replacement and say like, yeah, this is what's covered, case closed. But the question is, how long is the hip replacement gonna last? What happened to the person in the first place that made them need a hip replacement? So there's definitely a lot more conversations now and a lot more of a movement towards health management organizations, so HMOs, that are going in that direction. The second thing that I wanted to highlight is preventative care is actually starting to be taken seriously, which is pretty amazing. And I see this in my sector actually really driven by employers who are self-insured. So if you think about like really big companies, you think about Home Depot's, PepsiCo, et cetera, their employee population is actually so large that they basically, for lack of a better explanation, end up being health insurance companies because they have scale. And so, by the way, there's one billboard that I saw on 101 in the Bay Area that went along the lines of, if you're a business, you're in the business of healthcare. Because fundamentally, if you are employing people, you are going to be talking about insurance. So the thing that's happened that I think is really interesting with the pandemic and that employers have been really responsive to is things like mental health, paying attention to your well-being. Those things are no longer kind of like second-tier fluff areas. You legitimately have employers and HR departments that are investing in those programs to keep their employees healthy for the long term. So I think it's super exciting. Again, I want to plug the health tech and med tech industry because there's a lot of really exciting opportunities there for engineers and certainly well-rounded folks that come out of Olin. And with that, I will close and see if there are any questions. In the
So for a little bit of context, I work for Epic Systems, which does electronic medical records.
Oh,
my understanding is one of kind of the big pushes in terms of Epic's perspective is things like population health, things like kind of large scale, anonymized data and applying that towards medical purposes. And I was wondering what impact you expect kind of using large scale data and like population information towards things like identifying risk and preventative care and those sorts of kind of things to minimize the amount of cost for people, just getting admitted to the ER when something like that happens.
Yeah, totally. No, it's a super, super rich area. And thank you for that question. There's a lot that we can learn from population health. There's also this notion of essentially personalized health, if you will, right? So a lot of, if you look at things that like doctors learn in med school, a lot of them are really at the population level. And so what that means is, you have your like standard distribution curve and things are usually tailored to the needs of 50%. Now, that's great, again, on population level, but if you as an individual happen to be in one of the tails, like you're kind of screwed. And so the thing that's actually super exciting to me is not only getting all of those data aggregated at the population level, but really transitioning that to personalized interventions, personalized healthcare. The other thing that I want to mention is really quickly, and I know there's maybe that's one of the topics that maybe we're missing is like machine learning and AI. So yeah, we all know like this is a big thing, but I want to caution people to come to those topics with like a little bit of skepticism, especially coming from like the Bay Area and Silicon Valley. Basically, like everything's like machine learning and AI. But fundamentally, it's like garbage in, garbage out. If you have unlabeled data sets, like you're not going to get anything useful out of them. And I think companies like Epic are a really good start in terms of getting like large data sets. I don't know enough about like the rigor with which those data are kept. I also know that those electronic medical records are only gonna be capturing like a slice of a person, and that slice is probably coming from when they were in the hospital or like checking in with their primary healthcare provider. It is not the data that happens in like the 99% of their life, which is really super important as well. So this is where we start talking about fitness trackers. We all have like phones and other accelerometers that can do like step counts. So that's one like example of how those large data sets can also be married with data sets that we have in our everyday life to form a more complete picture.
Thank you.
I saw there's a couple that,
I just wanted to say I worked for the Department of Health and Human Services this summer, and my role was to conduct a lot of scientific design research on how the social determinants of health affect people within the U.S. And this is sort of the concept that like a lot of factors from like transportation and access to like food access and education and job security can affect your health. And as someone who is like moving from like, or I guess first I saw a lot of the themes that we identified in Immersive, like echoed through here, and it was really cool to like also learn more about the historical context of like how we got here. And then second, as like a like engineer and a room of like people with engineering degrees who live in the U.S. mostly and like work and like live in different communities and care about our personal health and the health of our communities. Like, what are some actions that you would recommend that are things that we could do to sort of push towards more preventative healthcare and like preventative healthcare for our communities and like more health outcome oriented?
yeah, I think, so let me answer your question first, and I want to take a little bit of a segue based on some of the comments that you made. I think the key word in your question is actually community. There's a lot of strength in community and actually having people around you that are also on your health journey, whether it's about improving how much you move during the day, whether it's about improving the types of things that you eat, whether it's getting into cooking, whether it's taking up meditation, etc. Like fundamentally, if we look at the factors that really impact lifestyle, so you have diet, you have exercise, you have sleep, you have stress, and actually one of them is community and a sense of belonging. So I think one of the very concrete things is quite frankly just be human and care about the people that are around you. And so that may not be the most satisfying practical answer, but that's the one that I do want to leave you with. The other comments that you made me think about, and this actually segues into sort of like two of my interests. One of them is healthcare, the other one is education. So if I go back to this slide, and we're looking at this like measly 309 non-preventative healthcare versus some of the other things that the healthcare system is actually working on. One of the things that I muse on is what actually defines preventative healthcare. Because fundamentally, there's a lot of health issues that can be fixed if people have access to food, if they have access to transportation, and if they have somewhere to go and sleep at the end of the night. And the way that I connected this to education, to my other passion, very much stemming out of Olin, is if you really want to make an impact in education, in a lot of ways, Olin is a phenomenal example of how to do that, right? We've built a college from scratch. In a lot of ways, we've redefined what it means to present engineering curriculums and to really be an engineer. But holy cow, by the time that you get to college, you're already assuming a certain trajectory. you have to rewind way, way back. Not to high school, not to middle school, you're looking at K through 5. And you know what makes an impact there? It's food. It's being able to eat, and it's having a space to do homework at the end of the day. So I think one of the things that, again, I struggle with is, holy cow, is preventative care really just making sure that people are fed? And I have a hard time running along there. So thank you for letting me have that segue, and I think we can transition to everyone come down.
Thank you so much for all the Well, I'm certainly leaving you all with a lot of food for thought today. A couple quick things. First, thank you so much to our presenters, who are all fabulous. Really, really appreciate it. And second, I just want to say, put in a little plug for a new program that we're prototyping this year. You may have heard me talk about it, or you may have seen it, in announcements. It's called the Olin Learning Lab, and as you can see, our alumni have so much to teach and to share in terms of their experiences. So we've had some really good prototypes this summer and this fall in terms of alumni teaching other alumni, teaching students, parents, faculty. Obviously, it's all virtual right now. We'd love to get to the point where they are in person, but if you have something that you would be interested in sharing, I would love to hear from you. We're lining up programs right now for January, for the spring, and for next summer. So this is just a little teaser of what that program can become.